Joan Blair, Center for Biologics, USFDA. I don't have a joke, but I'll try to elicit a chuckle. I have lots of things to say, and for those of you who know me, I'm going to have to really constrain myself and limit my remarks. So I'll pick up on one thread that I
That's
think
it, Joan. Time's up.
Mike knows me well. So I'm picking up on the thread about the capacity building element that was in all of the comments made. Perhaps a concrete action item to take forward is an inventory, but an inventory of the models that are in use to deal with the regulatory capacity needs. We're talking the HSA model, the EU model, the AVREF model, the networking models that are out there for those countries who are contemplating how to deal with the burdens they're facing. If we had an inventory with core principles, the operating principles, the drivers, for example, for the European system, what are the core principles that drive the HSA model? So that a locality can look at the shelf of products that they could look to adopt that's appropriate for their environment. And because there is a proliferation of these networks and approaches that are already launched, those existing initiatives could look to such an inventory, the pluses and minuses, and decide perhaps they want to evolve their own initiative to take on elements that are, or principles that are in another model and adapt their existing network to accept some of those principles. But I think that might be a very handy one-stop shop, because some of these countries, they hear these presentations, but they really would like an assessment or a very clear inventory and delineation of the principles. What worked, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of these different models?
Mike Ward, Health Canada. I'd like to thank the panel for a lot of thought-provoking ideas, and the previous panel as well. And I think we have the people in the room here, and hopefully recommendations coming forward to come up with what I'll call the big picture, because I think that's what we're talking about here. And there's a lot going on. We've heard that yesterday and today. Internationally, a lot of good work. But this is about connecting the dots. And I think we're still working in silos between regulatory harmonization initiatives, organizations, and even within product lines, between vaccines, pharmaceuticals, generics, et cetera. So I think we've got to bring that together in a cohesive way. And I think Mary Lou was talking about mapping, taking stock. That is absolutely necessary. I would say that in the pre-market space, one thing that hasn't been mentioned, but you will be hearing about, is the generics initiatives, where we're actually looking at what we can do as regulatory authorities to work share around generic drugs because of the huge pressures facing those programs. And I would say it's not just about resourcing in lesser developed regions, but also the most developed regions. And so the generics initiative is an example of that, where even the US, Europe, et cetera, are involved in this. And in terms of resourcing and commitment, if we have all these initiatives going on and our respective heads of agency are responsible for resourcing this, I think there's got to be a level of discussion that takes place at the very highest levels of our agencies. And that, in turn, should drive everything. We can have discussions amongst technical experts, amongst fairly senior people, but it really has to engage the highest levels of our agencies. We talked about, David was talking about institutional development plans. I think what we're talking about here is an international regulatory cooperation development plan to bring these various elements together. Key, I think, to all of this, and maybe a hub for these activities, is the concept of a regulatory secretariat. that could really support the various initiatives. I'm involved in the generics initiative. We've had an APEC workshop on biosimilars, exactly the same issues. You know, can we afford to do these things independently? I would say no. And finally, I think talking about the tools, the enablers, confidential information, and how we get beyond that. And a secure platform. As was mentioned, we're talking within the Americas of the PAO platform on access innovation. Could this be a model globally? We're confronting these issues in the generics initiative, and you will hear about this in the next WHO drug information publication. But this is a real challenge for all authorities. So I think we need to get around and have the enablers necessary, the tools necessary to be able to do the work. But I think it has to start at the top level and at least involve the heads of agencies. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So I think we'll collect all 4 comments and questions, and then if the panel wants to respond to any of them, please.
So I really like David Wood's comments about the business case. 'Cause I think
Can you introduce yourself,
Oh,
please?
sorry. Mark Walensik from the Harvard Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center. I was saying I really like David Wood's comments about the business case because I think that is the lack of a clearly and well-defined business case, and whether it's a 20-year business case plan, over the next 20 years we want to do something to move the needle, or whether it's a 5-year plan is really important. And I think stakeholders are not necessarily clear what we're talking about, and moving the needle where, and what's really important and what's not. In my own conversations over the last 5 to 10 years, many of the folks I talk to that are stakeholders would say, well, harmonization or regulatory alignment, that's really being done by ICH. No need to worry about that. ICH is carrying the ball. There's a process in place. The regulators, to some extent, are there. Not all of them, but many of them. And so we're covered. And I think that one of the tenets of this discussion is that may be necessary but not sufficient. But it's not clear what, in addition to continuing the ICH process, is needed. And what are the opportunities? Just like the millennial goals, for example, galvanize support. I would love to, if Vincent has discussions with Bill Gates about we'd like to do regulatory harmonization or regulatory alignment, and we'd like $100 million, and he asked what the business case was, that's a really hard conversation, I think, for him or other stakeholders to have about why money should be invested in this area and what it's really about. So I thank you for your comments, and I would ask the other panelists to talk about how we develop the business case, where we develop it, and what the opportunities are to really hone that down so that it's not just the ongoing ICH process, unless that is the solution.
Why don't we take, since there's a lot being said here, why don't we take some responses from the panel, and then we'll move on to the questions. Anybody want to respond to any of those 3 comments?
First of all, I think the business case is critically important, and how we best define that is we're not a homogeneous group, and my concern is the opportunity to really be able to enunciate those principles collaboratively. It's the how, but it's clearly that's the one approach that will be able to. It's a raison d'etre for regulatory work and regulatory harmonization and any additional initiatives that need to be built.
So, I mean, just building on some of the points that were made, I mean, I agree fully with what Mike was saying, that this case has to go up to the top, to the heads of agencies. But I think it goes beyond, just the heads of agencies here. With, it's got to go into the, who they report to in government. So I think that yes, we have to make that case at the highest level, and we've got to be clear about what is the case that we're making. So I think that comes back to some of the conversations that we're just having. So we've got to make sure that we know what we're asking for and why we're asking it. But yes, it has to go up to the very highest level. The issue about develop an institutional development plan for sort of networks is, I think I heard what you say, and I think that maybe also is something a little bit Joan was saying. How do we identify best practice to develop capacity in a way that takes advantage of the networks that are in place, you know, and that we begin to try to be thinking in network terms rather than individual terms, and how can we come up with tools that will help us to work and make best use of those existing networks. So I think that's maybe a gap at the moment we don't have, and that's something that we could focus on for the future. How do we strengthen the networking activities and build capacity for those networks, not just the individual agencies?
Just to pick up on one point, particularly what Mike was saying, and Vincent, we haven't, I'll speak for myself, as a public, coming from a public health regulatory agency, that's what we do. So we are great on the science, we can lead with the science, we can lead with very strong development of standards, review practices, whatever is in our regulatory remit. But what regulators aren't mission to do well or are not able to do well is really begin to make that economic analysis, that case of why this is good business. And on the flip side, for less resource countries, it really takes an incredible amount of courage and creativity to say, I'll let go. I'm going to let go of some of this, and I'm going to rely on others' decisions and change my regulatory model. And so I think it really calls into question how we need to do this together. I mean, because we will all we're at different places, we all have different kind of approaches and our mission differently, but by coming together, I think we can really break down those walls and help to build that vision, but also that courage it's really going to be required to do. The second thing is that we're also not very good about really positioning the imperative for regulatory systems and even the broader global public health dialogue. I mean, and we've got to get better at that. You know, we had at WHO a lengthy discussion about public health workforce. Regulatory workforce was not an element in that discussion. So again, there's so many opportunities, I think. We just need to make sure, where do we get the biggest impact? How do we really work together to expand our reach so that we can make that impact?
Do you think, Lou, it's also fair to say that it's difficult for regulatory agencies to advocate and advertise their successes?
So, Michael, absolutely not. And I think one of the things we've done in the past couple of years, and our Deputy Commissioner Deb Otter is here, is begin to make that kind of case. And you'll see a lot more reports coming out from WHO, or you'll see a lot more engagement, like, you know, the IOM report on essential elements of regulatory systems. How do we make the case for regulatory systems, and how do we begin to look at not just training, but what's the basic global curriculum, and how do we as a regulatory agency move from kind of a domestically focused to more of a global public health paradigm. So I think absolutely we can be catalytic, and to David's point, it can't just stay with us. So while we may say this makes perfect sense, we have to convince our ministries of trade, our ministries of foreign affairs, our economic, you know, our development assistance agencies, that these types of investments will really, really expand the strength and the base of any emerging economy, or any of us.
Just to follow up with the points about mutual recognition, I think in Singapore, we engage our stakeholders very regularly. So we do engage our industry as well as our healthcare professionals, which is our indirect stakeholders. And I think we're talking about the silos between product lines. I think we have this same model that we have for the drug regulation in terms of the full expedited as well as the abridged evaluation. But I think when we went on to do all the medical devices, you know, that mindset didn't, you know, go on to look at the regulations for the medical devices as well. So we actually did get a bit of backlash from our industry as well as our healthcare professionals. And I think one of the few things that they mentioned which was quite relevant, and I think I could reflect here, is that they say that if your regulators can't even mutually recognize each other and don't even have mutual trust for each other, then how do you expect us as the industry or even the consumers to have mutual trust, on you as a regulator that you are doing a correct job? I think that then reflects very well, I mean, we brought it back and then we actually see where are the areas that we can improve on. And I think the key principles that we actually leverage on would be, to look at key reference agencies, so we don't want to duplicate the work. And in fact, this was in line with what they have mentioned. If FDA has approved it, EMA has approved it, Health Canada has approved it, what is the additional value add that you have, as an agency that you can contribute to the whole regulatory process? If not, can you just, focus more on the post-marketing, rather than the pre-marketing aspects of it? So we leverage on the key reference agency. We also looked at marketing history as well as safety history of the devices or of the products itself. So if it is marketed elsewhere and if it's safe with no known safety alerts, then we will let go even earlier. And I think the secure platform then to look at sharing will be very important, because in terms of the safety history, there's often a difficulty in trying to get the information unless we have a collaborative MOU partnership with that agency. We won't be able to get that data out very easily from other agencies. I think the other one was on the top-down approach in terms of the head of agencies meeting, whereby we have to get the senior management to approve us. But I think the other thing is also to look at bottom-up approach. Because I think many a times, even though the senior management can approve of a strategic plan, sometimes the bottom approach would be to say that it's not pragmatic. You don't understand what is going on the ground. You think that this can work, but actually it doesn't work. So I think we have to utilize both the top-down as well as the bottom-up approach to make sure that the whole action plan actually works. And I think in terms of the business case is something that I think will be very good for us to work on, because I think the IOM workshop itself have actually worked out in terms of the challenges, the gap analysis, the strategy, and then ending off with what the solutions and action plans are. And as I've mentioned, the other one would be also to look at best practices from other industry, because I mean, maybe this is something that I throw down to the ground itself. If other industries like aviation and all those, they can do it, I don't understand why we have health products regulation couldn't do it. Thanks.
Okay, sorry to keep you all standing here. So let's take these comments and questions, and then panel will address those, please.
Mohab Nasser, excuse me, Mohab Nasser, GSK. Very good discussion about harmonization. And I think as we go to more sharing of some of the initiative and challenges we have, I would argue that we'll continue to go in a vicious cycle, because there is a foundation that I don't think we addressed fully in this workshop. And that's what I consider or call regulatory transformation. What is the role of regulator in the 21st century? Is it to micromanage and to evaluate development and manufacturing, or is it to assure quality, safety, and the efficacy? And we need to focus on what the key regulatory functions before we decide to move into harmonization of these key regulatory functions. Otherwise, we will continue to have a discussion about capacity building and the enhancing activities that may not be value-added. Thank you.
Limit Trago, WHO. I'm just very much in line that the previous comment was, just starting from an example. We created quite a good platform and SharePoint for sharing inspection results. We provided it to certain countries which I don't want to mention. And we encouraged them to share the inspection reports and the inspection plans to have less duplication and doing more meaningful sharing resources, risk-based approach, what they do in terms of inspections in big picture. Now, the platform is there, But what is not there is populating it with the data from these countries, and what is not there is willingness to have joint inspections or coordinated inspection plans. So platform is there. Now then I'm coming to the next point I wanted to make, is that we are talking a lot of the institutional development plan, capacity building, but I'm very much in line with what the previous commentator said. We have to be very clear. Capacity when, where, and for what. And there is no single good answer for that, because there is no single model. And I would say that in certain cases we need much more capacity to have collaboration, cooperation, and understanding the global regulatory situation to pull it together on the agency level, which is probably a capacity in its own right. And also it has to be built into the post description, because what we face is that the small agencies, there are a number of collaborative arrangements already around. There are new collaborative arrangements coming. And it is all coming to the daily, top of the daily work already full, so to say, plate. Now, if the collaboration, cooperation, and networking is not built into the institution structure as somebody's job to be done with the specific capacities to be developed to make this agenda going ahead in the 21st century, I don't think we move anywhere, and we have this vicious circle, because building more capacities is not necessarily cutting through the vicious circle. It's not absolute, but it's clearly absolutely not true that only capacity building will solve all the problems. It doesn't. You have to know capacities for what and where and when. Thank you.
Larissa Lapteva, FDA. I have a question from a slightly different area, and it's addressed to Dr. Wood. Sorry for putting you on the spot. You have mentioned about the World Health Initiative on tropical diseases, tropical neglected diseases, the plan that's in place for the year 2020. And my question is whether WHO has any initiatives in relation to rare disorders, rare diseases worldwide. There are about over 7,000 of these disorders. They're oftentimes genetic and errors of metabolism, small patient populations where multi-regional clinical trials are oftentimes not a choice but a necessity. So the question is whether there are any WHO initiatives in relation to encouraging drug development for rare disorders.
Angela Long, U.S. Pharmacopoeia. I want to touch on three of the topics that were brought up today: resource constraints, capacity building, and strengthening regulatory science. As pharmacopoeias, we're actually going through a very similar exercise right now and looking at our own challenges and harmonization. And so we've been having several meetings, thanks to WHO and other gatherings, where the pharmacopoeias are really addressing some of our own issues. In our latest meeting, where we had regulators in the room, we heard that while we are national pharmacopoeias or a regional pharmacopoeia, many countries don't have pharmacopoeias, so they rely on especially those stronger pharmacopoeias in their drug approvals and post-market surveillance. So that the question would be along the lines of relying on other organizations, partnering on other organizations, especially pharmacopoeias. When it comes to capacity building, I know that our own organization is actually working with the regulatory authorities, health ministries, and pharmacopoeias throughout the world in education programs and adopt-adapt agreements, et cetera. I want to sort of finish up on the strengthening of regulatory science with a little story. I was recently in Mysore, India. We were visiting with the head of the Indian Pharmacopoeia, who happens to be a vice chancellor of a Indian pharmaceutical or medical school with a pharmacy school. And he invited us there, and we met with his regulatory science students that day. And he expressed strong interest in looking at ways to collaborate in the world with other regulatory science programs on building their own regulatory science program and curriculum. And so USP took that to heart, and we actually gathered some schools that are in the US and had a teleconference call about how we could collaborate worldwide on regulatory science programs. So there's that sort of initiative afoot, and we certainly would want to involve regulators at some point. So again, the question, or the question to the panel is, how do you engage, how can regulators engage other organizations, including pharmacopoeias?
We better stop there a minute. So David, you had a specific question, and if there's any specific responses from the others, if we can do that.
And that's a little difficult, specific question for me to answer, to be honest. I mean, WHO is, the agenda globally is now very much going into the non-communicable disease area, and so from a very strong focus on communicable diseases to move into non-communicable diseases, but that's not focusing so much on the rare diseases and the drug development for the rare diseases. I personally, I'm not aware. Lembit, are you aware of any initiatives?
Actually, there have been collaboration. In the organization. Just what I said, that historically WHO has been involved with neglected diseases and products through the TDR, which was special program for neglected and tropical diseases, where there was WHO involvement in facilitating clinical research in the specific target countries with the specific disease populations, because often these environments are very difficult to set up clinical trials, and there was some role. Now, for the time being, this program has been downsized, it's under reorganization, and I'm not really able to give us, David, comprehensive answer, which will be the vision in the future of involvement of this type of activities and facilitating clinical trials in these settings.
So any other brief responses to Angela, Lembit, or Mohab?
Just a brief response to the neglected infectious diseases, specifically neglected tropical diseases, in which it's important to acknowledge the contribution of the pharmaceutical industry in the donations that they've been making, and their commitment to focus on the research and development of new tools for those class of diseases. The critical issue is, of course, what is the infrastructure and capacity to conduct the clinical trials that are so needed, not elsewhere, but in those particular regions themselves. And, some of the collaborative work and harmonization that we're speaking to have to be brought into play to be able to accomplish that.
I think with regard to some of the comments, a brief response would be, I think, political will ultimately is the most important. I mean, I think Mary did mention about, getting political will from the economic and trade angle. And I think in addition to that is also to get political will from the public health angle as well. Because if we want to share and make sure that there is proper sharing and information exchange, then and if countries do not want to share, then I think the only thing to get around that is to make sure that politicians, give the commitment to do that.
Maybe I just pick up on one thing that Lembit mentioned, and that's the capacity building for collaboration. I think that's a very, very good suggestion in terms of how to collaborate well and effectively. It, isn't necessarily always obvious or something that people, naturally are able to do. So I think it's worth putting time and effort into working out what our best practice is, how to effectively collaborate and engage in these collaborations.
Okay, our time is getting limited, so we have 4 more questions. If you could keep them more concise. Thanks. Peter?
This will not be a question, but more a point of view. I've been a little bit discouraged that there seems to be a lot of emphasis on the need before taking action of developing a business model, of sending information around the world about successful ways to harmonize, etc. And what I want to emphasize is the duty of regulators to use creativity and leadership, not to worry about your statutory authority. That's your least of your problems. I've never seen a regulatory statute that prevented a regulator from doing the right thing. So get out ahead of your governments everywhere, rich countries, poor countries, whatever they are. Let's take a look at history. Some of the most important things that FDA has ever done still aren't written into statute. For example, in the 1970s, FDA created a completely new model of regulating over-the-counter drugs. That's still not in the statute. FDA created and showed leadership on developing guidance. The regulated industry, with a lot of regulators around the world, created ICH. That's not in regulatory statutes. I could go on and on and on. Some of the most important harmonization efforts have never been sort of created by statute, or they're created after the regulators invented them. And that's what often happens, that your governments will follow you if you show leadership. Time and time again, that is what has happened. I'll give just one example in the United States: accelerated approval. That was created by FDA in 1992. Congress then came along in 1997 and, of course, pretended that they invented it, which is a politically appropriate thing for them to do, and it happens time and time again. So don't look to others. Look to yourself and decide what makes sense and do it.
Who wants to vote? Who wants to vote? Maybe we should make Peter next commissioner of FDA. So if we could keep our comments a little briefer than Peter's.
Okay, thanks. 2 quick comments. Last week we had the head of COFEPRIS, Mexico, Apaho, meeting of the regulatory agencies. And coming back to making the business case, the model, he actually came with a very interesting look at how involving in the development of institutional plans, internal institutional plans, change management, and then linkages with reference agencies can have an enormous economic impact in a country, not only for the regulator, but actually for the pharmaceutical sector. So I would urge that we look at that in some degree. However, also urge caution, because as regulators, the domain is in public health. And so we need to be careful in making the economic case to less developed countries in this regard, because they often perceive it as then perhaps larger markets having interest in access to smaller markets. There, I would also urge that we then kind of triangulate the cooperation, whereby, you know, WHO, PAHO in this regard, begin to act as the honest broker between the reference and counter-reference systems. And we're seeing this, for example, in our region, whereby El Salvador is now linking into Mexico in registration. Mexico links into US FDA. And we see this beginning to proliferate around our region. And I think we really need to look at these models to see how we can make it work and see where this space, this common space, and the brokerage of WHO can be in this area.
Thank you. Margaret?
Thank you. My contribution is basically focusing on 3 issues. One is to see to it that if at any point in time we shall be able to at least assist regulators in developing countries with some minimum standards on good regulatory practice. And I'm saying this because, yes, we all are aware of the basic minimum that a regulator is supposed to do in terms of the core regulatory functions. But I think the challenge has always been the application of what is expected of a regulator to do. And I think, given the fact that, for example, most of the regulators in the developing countries, they are overwhelmed already with a lot of responsibilities. You have a situation where they cannot perform all the regulatory functions, but also even the infrastructure is not really conducive enough for them to be able to perform what they're expected to do. So maybe just to follow up to what Lembit was saying, maybe it's high time we looked into the current status where you are in a globalized world. A lot of new developments have come in, and maybe come up with some guidance that will help the regulators to really apply the principles of how best they can do the regulation, whether it's safety surveillance or market control, all those aspects. So that is on one hand. But another one is to do with harmonization. And I think we've listened to a lot of presentations on harmonization, and I think we all recognize the fact that there are various versions of harmonization, and of course also recognition of the need for harmonizing those. But again, when it comes to a country, especially again in a developing country where you have a regulator who's overwhelmed with local issues, but at the same time, they are expected to also participate in regional or global harmonization initiative. How do we guide them to actually be able to contribute to that process, given the current developments globally, regionally, and even at a national level? And the third part that I would want to see that at some point, based on these standards of practice, regulatory practice, harmonization practice, then we should have some kind of a framework for accountability, whether it's through some code of practice for regulators to say, this is the basic minimum that you're expected to do, and if you don't do this, then there should be some kind of accountability system embedded at some point. So those are my three contributions that I want to make to this audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Last comment?
I'll be very quick about Toshi Tominaga, Osaka University. The one thing which has not been pointed out is the opinion of the public. If I'm not in the regulatory authority anymore, but if the Japanese are content with saying that, okay, this drug is approved by FDA, therefore tomorrow it's on the market of Japan. That the leadership has pointed out. But how can we first fathom the opinion of the public, and if necessary, the enlightenment or education or transparency to the public to make the decision is also important. The great feat of FDA has been pointed out several minutes ago, but the thalidomide, because of the disharmony of FDA, FDA is loaded, and Japan, for example, had a terrible tragedy about the drug. Thus, the public might be hesitant about the harmonization. On the other hand, it is foolish to reinvent the wheel. So therefore, there must be some balance, and even the leadership as alone, or the leadership of the regulators alone, can be the fact, or the politician's role was pointed out. But how the public, the broad public, can be brought into the context. That's my question, but that is broadly should be at least considered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're just about out of time here, so any brief responses to James or Margaret, or are we? No, we're good. Well, thank you. I think this was a great panel discussion, and I don't have a joke either, because I couldn't find one on there. So all of you try to Google regulatory humor and see what you come up with. So I'm done.
Thank you for a great session. We meet back here again at 12:30, and I want to just have a very brief interlude. The IOM forum that sponsored this workshop, the Forum on Drug Discovery, Development, and Translation. There are a few diehard members of the forum that are here, and I wanted them to stand up quickly and just say their names so that if you want to advise IOM and the forum to do more in this area, you can talk to them. Lynn and Gary, I think, are there others? Lynn Hudson, Gary Filan. Okay, have a good lunch. Thanks to the panel.